Welcome, students. Scholars, it's a pleasure to have you here. So for tonight's lesson, for our flipped lesson this time, we are going to be working on a little foray into the role of Africa as it enters the colonial exchange. Now, we're doing this all in reverse because we've already talked about the terrible reality of enslavement, at least a little bit at this point already. But we've kind of put the cart before the horse. We've talked about what happened to African folks and folks of African descent, African Americans, Afro-Caribbean folk, etc. What we have not talked about thus far is how it is that Africa became a part of the colonial exchange, right? Because there are three key groups of people that enter into the colonial exchange, at least as far as America is concerned, right? There's the Native Americans, who are already here, the Europeans who do the colonizing and the exploring, etc., and then there are African folk who are brought in as enslaved people. And we are going to take a look at all these elements. We've already taken a look at the Native Americans a little, and we're going to review that a little more. But right now, we're going to take a look at Africa at the dawn of the colonial exchange and how it is that African people, Afrocentric people, people of color get caught up in the American experiment in such a horrific and unfortunate way. So let's take a look at how that came to pass. So the first thing we got to understand is Africa was not necessarily an impoverished part of the world. We have an image in our mind today of Africa as somewhat impoverished today. But at the time, that was not quite the reality. At the time, West African nations had actually been quite wealthy. And this is due to what's called the gold salt trade. See, these nations had overflowing quantities of gold. And during the post-classical period, during the Middle Ages, African kingdoms such as Mali, Benin, etc., made contact with the Arab world. The Umayyad Caliphate and the Abbasid Caliphate, and then after that, the Turks. And with this contact, we'll also have contact with the Fatimid Caliphate. We're not going to get into Egypt at the moment. We get into Egypt, we'll be here all day, and we're not trying to be here all day. So let's kind of lay down what's going on here. So these nations had rich gold deposits. What they required was salt. Salt was a necessity in a time before refrigeration. It was a way of preserving meat. So West African nations would trade gold for salt, and they became fabulously wealthy. Arab merchants would bring salt in from the Middle East and get gold. Kingdoms such as Mali grew rich off the trade, as you probably already remember from years past. This is also when the Arabic language was introduced into sub-Saharan Africa. This is why many traditionally African names, quote unquote, are also traditional Arabic names or traditional Muslim names, because they are all Arabic names. So occasionally you'll hear accusations be thrown at politicians, especially Black politicians, that they're quote unquote secretly Muslim, or accusations like that. And a lot of it just comes down to they were given traditional African names, and those West African names just happen to be ones that were borrowed from the Arabic language. It's not necessarily a sign of anyone's particular religious affiliation. Just a brief forward there. That's something you might find useful. All right, iron making. This is really Africa's pride and joy. The African people are unique among many of the peoples of the world in that they skipped the Stone Age and the Bronze Age and went right to ironworking. So most peoples around the world, ancient Europeans, ancient Middle Eastern folk, ancient Asian folk, Chinese, Japanese, etc., they had a Stone Age where they made their tools and weapons out of stone, and then there was there's in between phases where the Copper Stone Age and stuff. But eventually you get to the Bronze Age where they're making weapons and tools out of bronze, right? Mix of brass and copper, and then you get bronze is an alloy of copper and brass. In case you didn't know that, that's your science tidbit for today in history class. And then from there, societies learned how to make iron. Africa was unique. They didn't have to go through that step. They started making iron right from the beginning. So Africa was the first continent to develop iron tools and swords. However, iron mining is by its nature very dangerous. Iron ore deposits tend to be located rather deep below ground. And to do this kind of work, it was dangerous and difficult. There were risks of cave-ins, poison gas, etc., etc. It was not easy work. That's important to understand. That's why iron, even though Africa developed iron, and had a timeline advantage at making iron weapons and tools, it's why iron wasn't any more widespread in African societies than it was in societies elsewhere in the world, with the exception of the Americas, where iron really didn't take off as fast. So that's the first thing to sort of be aware of when we talk about the relationship between Africa and Europe. So traditional African slavery. So, as we all know, slavery is an ancient human institution, and most cultures have had some version of slavery. And African societies were no different. They had their own version of slavery. However, it's not like the slavery that we're going to be seeing in the Americas. Now that I've given you a moment to pause and reflect on what I've just said, I want you to think. So let's take a look at this. Because what do you mean they had slavery? Well, let me explain. So much like the ancient Greeks and Romans, slavery in the African world really came from two sources. You were either captured in war as a prisoner of war, or you were a convicted criminal who had committed a serious offense, murder, rape, kidnapping, something like that, something grievous. And you see, it's important to understand that in Africa, just like in most pre-modern societies, most societies before the 1800s really had no concept of long-term incarceration. That really wasn't something people did, right? Nowadays, it's very much the norm. You commit a serious crime, we lock you away for decades at a time, right? 10 years, 20 years, blah, 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 blah. That's normal to us. We see that as normal. To ancient, medieval, and even early modern people, that was not the way the world worked. Jail or prison was a place you sat while you waited for your punishment to be dealt out, or while you waited for your trial to take place. So most punishments came as either fines, beatings, maimings, or executions, right? It's either we're going to kill you, we're going to take your stuff, or we're going to hurt you, or we're going to hurt you really bad. So in such an environment, slavery as a punishment for a crime, that was seen as another way of doing it, right? instead of we're going to end your life by, killing you, by unaliving you, it's we're going to end your life as a free person. That was the solution, similar to a sort of life imprisonment sentence today. Your life as a free person is over, but you do get to still keep on living. So that's important to understand. So there was slavery, but it was not something that was foisted upon an entire ethnic group of people just by virtue of their race or ethnicity. That wasn't being done. Individuals found themselves as slaves due to certain circumstances. You were captured in a war. You had committed a heinous crime. Additionally, not all of these terms of enslavement were for life. People might only be sentenced to slavery for a term of years, right? So just as how you might get 10 years in prison in most societies today, there you might have received a sentence of 10 years of enslavement. You would be someone's slave for 10 years. And then when that term of service was up, you were let go. Now, slaves were used for often dangerous work that free men and women would not voluntarily do. And iron mining was one of these jobs that was often given to enslaved people, as it was dangerous and carried a very high risk of death, which many people did die in the process. Now, you might be saying, well, what does that have to do with the price of tea in China? Nothing, but it does have a lot to do with Europe getting involved. So what's Europe's interest in slavery? So European cultures had also had slavery since ancient times. You all know from your past studies, the Greeks had slaves, the Romans had slaves. During the Middle Ages, the Pope, the head of the Catholic Church, at the time the Catholic Church really dominated Europe, put out a papal bull, a decree, a law that said a Christian could not own another Christian as a slave. So now this was a major step towards eventually people coming to the major moral realization that slavery is wrong. It took us a while to get there as a species. And that was kind of the first step, of saying, look, if we are all brothers and sisters in the same religion, then it's not acceptable for one of us to own the other as their property. No, we're not doing that. However, the rich and the powerful, as they always have and always will, want a way to get things for free. They want free labor. So if they weren't going to get it the way they were used to, which is enslaving people right nearby them, they had to get clever. They had to get crafty. European lords and nobles came up with two solutions to get around this problem. The first was that slavery declined in Europe, but was often replaced by other systems that allow you to still extract free labor and still exploit people. You just didn't quite own them. Not fully, not technically. We've already looked at some of these systems, right? Peonage, right? The idea of you're working to pay off a debt. Or indenture, right? Again, this idea that we're gonna, you borrow money and now I have right to your free labor for the next few years until you pay off the debt. The other way of doing this was, as you all probably remember from either last year or the year before, is serfdom. right? You all remember the serf, medieval serf is bound to the soil. Well, that was the other solution. Okay, I can't own the people that work my fields, that's fine, but they're tied to the field. If I buy the field, they come with it. If I sell the field, they go with the field. And any laws I choose to make, they got to obey them because they're there. They're not allowed to leave under penalty of law. So that was a workaround of sorts. The other workaround was that since a Christian could not own another Christian as slaves, foreigners were still a viable source of slaves, right? If I want to enslave somebody, I've been told, hey, I'm going to go to hell if I enslave another Christian. Well, I got to go find somebody who's not a Christian. And especially in the Mediterranean, this was easy. Competing Christian and Muslim kingdoms frequently fought each other, and prisoners of war or civilians in conquered cities often found themselves enslaved. But this was still kind of traditional ancient history style slavery. A slave is a prisoner of war. So when do we get to the race-based slavery? When do we get to the evils of triangle trade slavery that you all have been waiting to hear so much about? We're getting there. So let's see how the transatlantic slave trade unwound. Europeans arrived in Africa. The Portuguese were the first to make contact with many African kingdoms, but soon the British, Dutch, and French, even the Spanish to some extent, were hot on their heels. And Europeans came with raw iron bars, ingots of iron, as well as pre-made iron tools and weapons. Now, African blacksmiths could make an axe or a saw or a sword just as well as any European could. They already knew how to turn iron ore into iron. That wasn't the issue. The issue was it was cheaper, right? In fact, I'd ask you guys right now, you're watching this video, I want you to take a look at the clothes you're wearing. Shoes. Open them up. See where the made on or made in tag is. Oh, wait. How many of you looking at those find that it says made in the USA? How many of you see it's made in China or Vietnam? So I'll let you know a little secret. There is not a single object that you're seeing that's made in China that could not be made here in the United States today, right? Your cell phone, well, your cell phone might be nicer than mine. Your cell phone, your electronics, Apple mouse that I'm holding up there, etc. Can all be, we could make them here. It would just be more expensive, right? We don't have everything made in China today because it's too hard for America to produce it ourselves. It's that it's too expensive. It's cheaper to simply buy the Chinese version than to make it ourselves. And African kingdoms found themselves in a comparable position. They already knew how to make iron tools and weapons. They'd been doing it long before the Europeans had ever figured it out. But the iron there, I got to mine that out. I got to find the iron ore. I got to have a smith make me something. You guys got off a boat. And you got ready-made iron tools and weapons right here. It's easier and quicker and cheaper to just buy the weapons and tools you brought with you than for me to have someone make it. And the Europeans did want something in return for their iron, but they weren't as interested in gold like the old Arab merchants had been. No, instead, what European nations were looking for were slaves. The Native Americans that many had tried to enslave before were dying out, running away. They needed a new type of person to enslave, somebody that was resistant to the livestock-based diseases the Europeans brought with them, but who didn't know the land so well that they could escape. And it would be amazing for anyone looking to enslave folks if these folks they enslaved looked very different from the free population. And luckily for the Europeans, African societies had already been trading enslaved people for centuries. And so when Europeans showed up and said, we're here to exchange iron tools and weapons for slaves, it wasn't seen as a particularly odd request. The only thing that might have made the European merchants seem different was the numbers. Whereas most people in African society might only be buying a couple of enslaved people, these European merchants were buying essentially in bulk. They were buying hundreds, sometimes up to 1,000 enslaved people at a time. Very large numbers, but they were willing to pay. And so many of the kingdoms on the coastline collaborated. And in many ways, to them, why shouldn't they? You must understand, to us, we often have these notions of Pan-Africanism, the all African people as being equally African and sharing a unique African identity. That is a very modern concept. If to an African king living on the coast, the people on the inland weren't his people. They were enemies at war. Right? They were a rival. And so when you conquered those rival soldiers, you took them as slaves. And if you had nothing to do with them and these strange pale folk just offered to pay you a lot of iron swords and weapons in exchange, why not? So let's compare and contrast. Why did this work? This was the perfect storm of horror. The Europeans had very good reasons to want to buy people from Africa. They had already been forbidden to own other Christians, and by this point, most of Europe had been Christianized. Native Americans who had initially been enslaved by Columbus and company had died of disease or ran out. African folk had been raising livestock animals for generations. They were accustomed to the livestock-based diseases that Europeans were going to expose them to, so they wouldn't get sick and die in massive numbers. African folk were also unfamiliar with New World geography, right? They weren't natives to that continent. Benefit to moving someone a whole continent over for you as the person holding them captive is that they don't necessarily know the lay of the land. If they run away, it's not going to be as easy for them to get to a safe haven. They're not going to know how to navigate by the stars. They're not going to know necessarily what plants are good to eat and not, or what animals are dangerous or not. And all of these kind of things made it a lot more difficult for an enslaved person to make their escape. A final thing that many Europeans saw as a benefit was, and this is where we talk about the beginning of race-based slavery, that African folk were physically distinct from the European, free Native American, and mestizo, that is to say, mixed half European, half Native American populations, right? A Native American that was held as a slave could pass for a free Native American or a free mestizo person, and so could very easily escape and still stay even in the same area unrecognized. So we know why Europeans wanted to enslave Africans. And yes, as confirmed by bullet point number 4 on the European side, their race, their physically distinct biological characteristics were a motivating factor. So why did African kings go along with this? Well, one, the iron. Even though they could make iron themselves, it was cheaper to purchase it from Europe. The guns and cannons, a weapon that Europeans had, Europeans and the Ottomans had both done remarkably well with. These weapons were often traded to the societies that helped supply European empires with their slaves. And so you get this sort of vicious cycle. Those who collaborated with the European colonizers and enslavers got all these extra weapons. Those weapons, of course, give them a military advantage in combat against the armies of nations that did not collaborate. This, of course, allows them to capture more prisoners of war and enslave them, which, of course, the Europeans are going to continue to enslave and purchase, and are going to pay these societies more iron tools and weapons and more guns and cannons as payment. You get this vicious cycle. For most of the societies doing the selling, these were not their countrymen, right? There's sometimes this rather disingenuous claim that, oh, well, why do African Americans have any care for African people? Those are the descendants of the folks who sold them into slavery. Well, not necessarily, right? People didn't sell their own people, right? You weren't selling your friends and neighbors to the Europeans. You were selling someone that was a foreigner, a prisoner of war. It would sort of be like if the United States had taken Taliban fighters that we had captured in Afghanistan and then sold them to North Korea to use in labor camps. It would be like if we did something like that, right? We don't necessarily care about those people. They're not one of us. We didn't do that, but I'm using that as an example. The same is with criminals, right? A lot of people, they were criminals. They were the murderers, the kidnappers, the rapists, the bad guys of society. So if all of a sudden someone says, hey, I'll take that really bad man, I'm going to put him on my big boat, I'm going to take him all the way away, you're never going to see him again. Oh, and I will pay you for this opportunity. You're going to be like, yeah, take him. So it was a perfect storm. So what comes about? This is the dawn of the triangle trade. Now, why do we call this the triangle trade? Because there is essentially 3 points in the exchange. European merchants would sell muskets and iron tools to African rulers and slave traders in exchange for slaves, in exchange for people to use as slaves. These European merchants would then crowd these enslaved people onto ships, often in brutal conditions. People stacked less than, in basically racks and human shelves, for lack of a better word, for the way these people were stored, with, barely any room to breathe or sit, chained one to another in stifling heat. People died by the hundreds on these ships. But those who made it to the Americas were then sold to be used as a labor source, usually on plantations. These merchants would then buy up large quantities of southern cash crops: tobacco, indigo, rice, sugarcane, molasses, etc., that were grown on the plantations, either the American South, such as rice, tobacco, and indigo, or the sugarcane and molasses from the Caribbean ones. And they would take these and they would bring them back to Europe, where they would then sell them and buy manufactured goods, tools and weapons, which they would then take, and the process continues. That's why it's called the triangle trade. Now, in truth, not all ships made this route. Some would just go back and forth between 2 points on a triangle. Some would go back and forth between multiple points on one side of the triangle. As we talked about previously, Boston merchants would often sell salted fish down to the plantations in the Caribbean, and would buy the sugar cane and molasses to use for making rum from those plantations, and take it up north directly to Massachusetts. So why are we doing this? I wanted y'all to learn a little bit how Africa ended up getting tied into this, and a little bit of the origin of the horrors of race-based slavery, how this happened. How did Europe and Africa come to have this kind of contact? So you all are going to have a worksheet to fill out, and you're going to use that worksheet as your homework assignment. So good luck, and make sure to hand that in as soon as possible. Thank you all, and have a wonderful day.